Christian parenting.
Welcome to the Living Wholehearted podcast. We are Jeff and Tara Matson, a husband and wife team who is shrinking the integrity gap in our own lives and helping others do the same. I'm a leadership and organizational development coach, and Tara is a licensed marriage and family therapist.
We believe that if you have a following, you are a leader, and how you lead matters. Whether you are leading in the home, work, or community, we are bringing you biblical, clinical, and relational wisdom to help you in every relationship that matters most to you. None of us do this perfectly, but we are leaning into the reality of our humanity and profound wisdom of grace. Well, today we are continuing our conversation about sexual intimacy. Many couples find themselves unsure where to start or what to do about this area of their life. There are just so many myths and misunderstandings, and we hope to bring some healthy doses of biblical, clinical, and relational truth your way today as we dive in the middle of our series on sexual wholeness. We have the privilege of speaking with some experts today who have done some fantastic research. They've co-authored the book, The Secrets of Sex and Marriage, and 8 Surprises That Make All the Difference. And today we're specifically talking to one half of that co-authored pair, Shaunti Feldhahn.
Well, Shaunti is a best-selling author, social researcher, speaker, and podcaster. With a graduate degree from Harvard, Shaunti uses her analytical background to help with relationships and help them to thrive. She and her husband, Jeff, have co-authored groundbreaking relationships books with nearly 3 million copies sold. As a popular media commentator, Shaunti's findings are regularly featured in both secular and faith-based media, including The Today Show, Family Life Radio, Focus on the Family, The New York Times, and Cosmopolitan. Shaunti, it's really great to have you with us today.
I'm delighted. Thanks for the chance to share.
Awesome. Well, we help leaders live with integrity, and a huge part of our mission is helping us live out our priorities and develop healthy relational patterns. It seems that so much of your research over the years lends itself towards relationships. So talk a little bit about your story and what has shaped your passion for research and helping others discover what is good and healthy.
Oh gosh, the pattern that I have followed to get here is probably a little bit different than most people, because most people, if you're interviewing somebody who talks on relationships, it's usually a psychologist, right? Or a therapist, or maybe a pastor. And that is so not me.
Okay.
I actually started out, believe it or not, as an analyst on Wall Street. And there was this crazy right-hand turn that happened in my life where I realized, and it's a sort of a long story, I can tell some of it if you're interested, but I realized I was hearing some things that men were thinking that were maybe things that I didn't realize as a woman. That I had been married a number of years at that point. I'm like, why haven't I heard this before? And they were really important, like heartbeat issues. And so the analyst hat kind of went on, and this whole thing started because I had this opportunity to do a big national survey of men, and really able to dig out some of these things that are surprising and important for us as women. And that ended up becoming a big bestseller. And then that funded the next research project and the next one and the next one. And so here, 20 years later, it's very weird to look back at that process and go, whoa, because I would never have been able to plan this. Let's just put it that way.
That's so fun, because that's true of so many of us if we allow the process to unfold instead of like forcing it, right? And so it sounds like you were listening along the way to what God was flourishing and growing. Now, were you excited about studying men and their thoughts, or was it intriguing to you, or you were just like trying to help your own marriage? What was the motivation there?
Well, this was about 20 years ago when this happened. And I guess I'd been married about 8 years at that point. And I was doing it. I'll tell you the reason I was doing all these interviews initially was because I was actually writing a novel. And one
Oh,
of the main characters in the novel was a man, and I didn't know how to put thoughts in his head.
I love it. I
So
love it.
I would just like, if I'd be talking to you, Jeff, right? Like
Yeah.
I'd be saying, okay, here's the scene
Right.
in this novel, what would you be thinking? Because I had to say what my main character was thinking, right? I don't know
Brilliant.
what a guy would be thinking.
yeah.
And so I would ask every guy, like, okay, here's a scene. What would you be thinking? And then as they started telling me what they'd actually be thinking, half the time I'm like, seriously?
Yeah.
I found myself really kind of shocked. But here's really what changed from just being this like fascinating, fun, shocking little project. I think what changed and what shifted in me and really set the course for all these other projects from then on is that as I started doing more of these interviews, in this case with men, it wasn't all that I did eventually, but in this case, I realized what I was hearing from these guys, it wasn't just that it was surprising. It was really foundational. Like these weren't thoughts and feelings that a man, sort of said, well, this kind of comes up like once every couple of months. These were things that the men were describing, thinking and feeling every single day, multiple times a day. And at that point, like I said, I think I've been married about 8 years. I'm like, what? Why? How could I not have known this? And other women then, as I was sharing it, they're like, wow. And I realized this is really important. Like this is foundational stuff if you want to love your husband well. And so that's really how the whole thing started. So, and to some degree, I've carried that kind of framework through. Like, I know my lane. I am not a therapist. I'm not a counselor. I can't cover the waterfront on, this issue or that issue. But what I can do is dig out the stuff that really matters, that you don't generally know that it matters, like the simple little things that'll really make a big difference once you're aware of them. So that's the way I've carried it through all the different projects, including this one.
Just because we started off on this, I would love to hear, can you share one or two of those things that blew you out of the water? Thought,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, that's what men are thinking.
Yeah.
Just, and then we'll move forward from there. I love this though.
Remember, stalling because we're talking about sex, or is this?
No. I know our audience is curious as to what are those two things because they haven't already read her work.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of them, for example, that was such it took me aback is how much vulnerability there is in a man's heart. I hate to say this, most of us as women, we kind of believe the mask you men wear. Right? Like you all look so confident, so, sure of yourselves. And it was this huge surprise to find out that there's so much self-doubt inside, where a man is going, I really, really want to be a good husband. Like I really want to be a great dad, but I don't know that I know what I'm doing. And I hope nobody finds out. And there's this vulnerability. And so we as women, we have our own vulnerabilities, but that's not necessarily one of them. Now, for some women it is. We found that in general, you could say kind of 80%, 20% on any of these issues with men and women. It's never 100%. But in general, most women aren't walking around going, oh gosh, I don't know what I'm doing as a mom, or I don't know what I'm doing as a wife, and I hope nobody finds out. It's like, no, I think I might have mom guilt, but I think, I know generally what to do. And I don't question whether, I measure up as much. I mean, I do sometimes, but it's not a big deal. And it's this huge thing to find out that for men, that's the reason for so much of what we see as the sensitivity. Why did that make him so mad when I just, re-cleaned the kitchen after he cleaned the kitchen? Like I had to do it the right way. Like, why did that make him upset? And it's because we don't realize how much a man, if a woman is questioning, and this is what we found statistically, sort of, am I lovable? Like, does he really love me? Like, that's an insecurity in a woman's heart. For man, it's, am I able? Like, am I any good at what I do?
That's so true.
That's what they're questioning. And so when you know that, it lends itself to a different way of approaching this most important person in your life. So, you go, instead of spending all your time going, oh, honey, I love you so much. If you're the wife, that's nice. Like, it's not that that's bad. That's nice, but it doesn't hit a man in the same way that it would hit us. And instead, you can realize, and we found this statistically, a man's version of I love you is thank you. It's noticing what he did and saying thank you for it, which says that was good. And I appreciate it. Thanks for taking the kids when I had that long Zoom meeting. You're such a good dad. Like, that's like a guy will run through a brick wall for a wife. And so that kind of stuff is so simple, and yet it really makes a difference. And so that's why we're so passionate about digging that stuff out in all of these areas of marriage.
Well, and what I appreciate about your work, and this information is in for men only and for women only, correct? Is that
correct?
Where people can find those resources. But what I appreciate, again, as a therapist and as a coach, there's a lot of story and individual, and a lot of people don't like the gender stereotypes. And yet with research, there's just some data that rises to the top. And we go, this is kind of the majority. You might be not typical, but that's majority to understand. And then it provides a place for us to have conversations as male and female.
It's a starting point, right? It's not the ending point, but it's the starting point. And, we always we do a lot of marriage events, for example. And we always say at the very beginning, now we're not even always talking about the men and women stuff. Like, we could be talking, like, we did a study of the secrets of the happiest marriages. And that, it turns out, there's not as much men, women, stuff there. It's about habits that matter. But we always tell people before we start, we're like, look, if 80% of men said one way, by definition, 20% didn't, right? Like, everybody's an individual, and use this as a opportunity to sort of open up a conversation about whatever the topic is, sex or whatever, and say, oh, wow, is this how you feel? Like, is this you? And that is what starts creating that connection and that intimacy and that togetherness, is because you're using it just as a starting point.
So good. Okay, well, let's dive in. Let's open the sex box and talk about let's start first with your most surprising, some of the things that came to the top where you were like, wow, I didn't expect that one in the research, when it came to healthy sexuality.
Well, okay, I will give you, for me, I will tell you right up front, everything surprised me. Like, nothing surprised Dr. Mike.
Okay, fair enough.
I know that you're talking to Dr. Mike in another podcast episode. And let me tell you, he's amazing because he's this nationally renowned sex therapist and he's heard it all. So nothing surprised him. But for me and my husband, Jeff, everything surprised us. And we were basically, to be candid, that is the lane we were trying to stay in. Like, rather than trying to cover the waterfront, what is it that the average couple, the non-therapist couple, what is it that we tend not to know? What are those little areas that if you just know it, it'll make a big difference? And so for me, one of the big ones was debunking. It's a very, very common subconscious myth that a lot of couples, I would say well over 90% of couples, have this subconscious idea in their head that if you two don't connect, like if one person is wanting more sex than the other, like, by the way, that is the most common day-to-day pain point. One spouse just wants more than the other. That's 79% of couples, right? Like, that's a huge percentage. But the reason for that, we think, is that the person who has the lower desire, we think it's just because they have a lower sex drive. Like, that's the reason we're not connecting. And if you think about it, that actually puts an awful lot of pressure on that lower desire person. And that statistically is usually the wife. Now, not always. We found 24% of couples, the wife was the higher desire. But for most cases, that's a lot of pressure. on that lower desire person, because then it's like, they feel like it's their fault. The higher desire person feels like, what's wrong with me? Am I not desirable? Can you take a pill to change your libido level? Like, what can we do about this? And the reality is that was so encouraging once we started looking into this, was to find that, that disconnect is there. And yes, that person may actually have a lower libido, a lower drive, but that's usually not the reason you're not connecting. And that there's all these other reasons that you need to look at. And a lot of them are so simple. And so that's actually, to some degree, that's most of what the book was about, is what are all those other reasons?
Are you going to leave us on a cliffhanger? Like they have to get the book? Or I could just see someone going,
you want me to give you an example of one?
Yeah, keep going.
I'll give you an example of one.
Yeah, give us a few. What were those smaller things?
Please don't leave on a cliffhanger. So I'll give you an example of one of these reasons that's super, super, super common. And it's, to me, honestly, I think it's probably the most important one to start with, which is that we don't realize that we mentally have this idea that there's just one way that sex works. Like, it's what you see like on a television show or on a movie. And there's a process that we see played out over and over and over again. And we think that's just the way it works, where, the guy and the girl look at each other and there's some sort of spark, right? There's some sort of hunger, desire for sex. And, both the people look at each other and they start kissing, and pretty soon the clothes are off and they're in bed, right? And so what you see is there was this surge of desire and they did something about it. Okay. And we all think that's just the pattern. And so if that's not what's happening in our life, we think something's wrong. Yeah. And the reality is that is one type of desire, but there's actually two. There are two primary types of desire. That one you could call initiating desire. But the second type of desire is called receptive desire. And actually, here's what, to me, was one of the biggest aha moments that I think is the most helpful for a lot of couples, which is that the person with receptive desire, the physiology of the desire works in the reverse order. So instead of I'm feeling that desire and I do something about it, the receptive desire person does not feel that sense of desire. That person is deciding to get engaged with their spouse. They are deciding to move forward. And then assuming that as they get into it, assuming that it's good and, it's a positive experience. And this is all, by the way, assuming that this is a marriage of goodwill, etc. But assuming that it's positive, then that person, the physiology starts to get stimulated. They start to get aroused. And then they feel that sense of desire that maybe their spouse felt 10 minutes ago. And that is so profound and so powerful for people to realize, because the top question that we get asked when we say, what one question would you want to ask a sex therapist or whatever? The top question by far actually is, why isn't my spouse interested? Why aren't they interested? And the reality is you're thinking of interest as being equivalent to what you see on the television screen. Interest to you means they feel desire and they're doing something about it. And the reality is your spouse probably is interested. It's just activated completely differently. And there's no right or wrong. It's two different physiologies created by God to be different. And so we have to honor both of them.
Parenting is the greatest role in the world, and it's also the hardest. It's rewarding, challenging, heartwarming, and exhausting. Sometimes it can even be confusing.
That's why Christian Parenting is hosting their 5th annual Perfectly Imperfect digital event called Every Parent Wants to Know. They have some really great friends and experts who are sharing their insights, experience, and wisdom to give you the answers to questions we're all asking. Jeff and I will be talking to you about how to raise children with healthy sexuality.
Well, join us on April 14th for Every Parent Wants to Know, where we'll hear from a host of speakers on character, faith in your home, grandparenting, tough topics, and even a topic just for the parents. Each ticket is $49, and you can get access through the end of the year.
We'll see you there.
And as you honor both of them, I mean, this just speaks to God's design, which is, I think he, each couple is their own individual. They're two separate individuals with stories and history and everything coming together. And then you just think every couple is going to be so different. It's a unique mix. There's no formula essentially for each couple. But what you're saying here is that in principle, God's design, amazing, like that he would, there would be initiation, there would be receptivity, but it requires patience. It requires love, in the form of love, which is considering others' interests, and being mindful of what other needs are in other persons. So many of those beautiful things that cultivate the relationship spiritually, emotionally, physically. We oftentimes call that the dessert of the relationship, but really it's the main meals, if you will, are the spiritual and emotional intimacy.
Yeah. So you talk about curiosity, and so Jeff is kind of leading that as a couple, you've got to be curious about who your spouse is and not assuming. So I loved how you framed that, and what the research showed is we assume a lot. And to recognize that just because there's not a desire there, that doesn't mean there's not a want or a hope for it, just the way we get there. So talk a little bit more about the curiosity and the fostering that.
Think about how different it is to have like the assumption, for example, of, what's wrong with you, right? Like something's broken. Like you don't match what I see on the screen, and that's just the way sex works. So there's something broken. And by the way, it's not just maybe the initiating desire person who thinks that, it's the receptive desire. Like, what's wrong with me? Because you don't know that this stuff happens.
Yeah.
And once you're aware of this, it's really interesting. We found curiosity is essentially an antidote to almost any problem, because you can have even the biggest issues in marriage. Now, this won't solve the big issues, but it'll make it easier to solve. And you can have pretty much anything that can be addressed in some way by actually kind of looking at your spouse and really truly wondering, like, oh, how does that work? Like, what does that feel like? Receptive desire. So talk to me a little bit more about that. Like, what is it? So what do you think when, like, I'm approaching you and it's been a long day? You mean you're not actually thinking about sex for most of the day?
Sorry, I'm trying not to laugh.
Whatever it is.
You just blew my mind, Shaunti.
But that's actually we do carry so much expectations and false understanding based on media today, right? And so we're laughing, but we also want to normalize, like, this is majority of couples. We just don't think to ask or to be curious. So keep going.
Well, and also think about I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say also just the conversations that we have with people, friends and in groups as we're learning about all of these things. I mean, that fosters the expectations that aren't in alignment with reality as well.
Yeah.
Totally. Well, and think about, since this is honestly, candidly, one of the reasons this issue is such an issue in marriage is, if you think about it, it is pretty much the only issue in all of marriage that we never talk to anybody, even our closest friends, about. We have no grid for anything other than our personal experience and what we see on the TV screen, and maybe what people said in the locker room when they were 15. Right. Which, of course, 15-year-olds are like the best source of information. And so if you think about it, it's actually not surprising at all that we would have a lot of like things that maybe are wrong in our minds and we don't really understand our spouse the way we thought we did, or there's heartache or confusion, like it shouldn't surprise us at all. And so if you think about curiosity being this, like, we call it a sexual superpower because it really honestly can help solve anything. Like, I'll give you an example. Suppose that you now know, oh my goodness, like one of us is initiating and one of us is receptive. Okay, let's just say that that's the pattern, which, by the way, that is the vast majority of marriages, where one is one and one is the other. And you get curious and you ask your spouse, well, like, okay, so if you're receptive, how can I approach that? Like, if I'm the initiating spouse, what is it that I can do that would actually, help you feel good about like making the decision? Because, for example, if you're a receptive desire person, you are making a decision to get engaged with your spouse often based on like how you feel about them that day, right? Like how the relationship is going. And so for the initiator to go, okay, what does that look like? What are some of the things that, are going to make that difficult? Well, you come in from work and I've been with the kids all day and you barely grunt to say hello to me and you go plop down in the lazy boy and want to turn on TV. And I get that because you've been working all day, but I feel like I'm just there to be your baby mama. And I'm just there to like cook for you. And so no, I'm not interested later in jumping into bed. Whatever it is that is shared in that conversation, it is actually as a result of truly being curious and truly wanting to know what matters.
Which is the communication factor that plays
Yes.
a huge role in healthy relationships and in healthy sexuality. So it's what I hear you leaning towards, which is empathy and a posture of humility. Teach me who you are versus let me tell you who you are. Let me
That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah. So Shaunti, I feel like there's so much to uncover here, but you'll have to get the book. And we also have our conversation coming with Dr. Sytsma as well. But I want to ask you, did you see any data in terms of the differences between male and female sexuality? You're saying majority of the women were the receptive desire.
73% of women had receptive desire, correct?
Okay. Well, something I've seen in my office over the last 20 years, one thing is when that curiosity happens and it's coming from a right motive. So tell me what needs to happen so that you would have a desire, and those conversations start. I have seen spouses start to pull back, particularly women, because then it feels like too much pressure. So talk about when the difference between healthy curiosity and when there's maybe an ill motive of like, I got to figure out the button that'll work. So explain that piece.
Well, what you're tapping on right there, Tara, is actually really, really crucial because there's something, and okay, we're going to be stereotypical here and talk about, the guy and the girl view on this, but there's a reason for the stereotype. Right? We've seen it so many times. This will not be everybody who's listening, but it'll be a good majority. There is a common desire amongst men. Give me the easy button. Like what's the switch I can flick and make everything work perfectly. And to some degree, that's understandable. I think because men really are statistically wired to be, okay, I'm a doer. What do I do differently? And that's fine, right? Like that's the way that many men are wired. However, on this topic, it can come across as very manipulative. It can come across as uncaring. And it's not necessarily, sometimes I'm sure there's bad motives in people, but most of the time, again, you've got a husband and wife who really care about each other. Right? They're trying hard, but they're not connecting. So it's like you're trying hard and it's not working. And so it's not surprising that a husband would be like, just tell me what I do. What steps 1, 2, and 3 do I do? And the reality is, it's interesting. This happened a week ago. Jeff and I were doing a marriage conference at a large church in Omaha. And we, the normal kind of marriage conference, like a Friday night, Saturday morning. And one of the sessions was on this topic. And we were talking at the end of the marriage conference on a panel with a pastor and his wife. And the pastor's wife said something that just struck me. And she said, you know what? I think men, because we were talking about how men want the easy button. And she said, and I don't know necessarily what it is that I necessarily want from day to day. Like, I don't know what it is that's going to actually achieve that sense of wanting to connect and wanting to be close. And she said, you know what? I think God set it up that way because he wants the husband to pursue his wife. And he wants the husband to be willing to learn and to be okay with the fact that it's going to be a voyage of discovery. And you can learn some principles that will work, like if your wife has receptive desire, give her anticipation time, right? Like, don't expect her to just be ready to jump into bed. Flirt with her in the morning and let her know what you'd love to happen that evening so she can start thinking about it. So there are some principles that work, but it makes a big difference if you will say, one of the things I'm going to need to do is just be attentive to what my wife needs today.
So good. Well, thank you, Shaunti. This has been fantastic. And I just want to give you the opportunity to share one last word of encouragement. If there's something that you didn't get an opportunity to say that you go, every couple needs to know this from this book. And then we'll let them know where to find the book and your resources.
That's sweet. Well, I think probably one of the biggest things that you'll probably talk about with Dr. Sytsma is the incredible importance of a couple just learning how to talk about it, learning how to communicate. And there's so much there. I will let you guys dive into with him on that. But the thing that to me was so encouraging is that I sort of feel like if Jeff and I could learn to talk about this, anybody could.
That's fair.
We were definitely not good communicators around this topic. And that's the beauty of this, is so much of this is so simple.
I love that. Okay, so where do we get the book?
So actually, you can get the book anywhere. But if you're interested in learning more, including, by the way, if this has raised some issues and you want to get extra help, we created a website with the same title as the book, secretsofsexandmarriage.com. And there's a lot of other resources that we've put on there, including referral resources for somebody who wants to check out a bit more.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for all that you're providing in your years of relationship research. I'm so glad that the Lord kind of took you on a left turn and we have the gift of all of this data. I'm a data nerd. I love it for the sake of application and to say it helps us to understand what are the typical developing healthy relationship patterns, and we have some sort of a framework. But if you are struggling and you happen to be in the Oregon area, we do have counselors. This is the work that we do day in, day out with our professional counseling at Living Wholehearted. Feel free to reach out at livingwholehearted.com. And for the rest of the country, definitely go to secretsofsexandmarriage.com and to find those referrals in your area as well. Thank you again for being with us, Shaunti.
Thanks, Shaunti.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
This podcast is powered by Living Wholehearted, Courageous Girls, and the Christian Parenting Podcast Network. Thank you for joining us in this critical movement of shrinking our integrity gaps between what we preach and live.